I'm your host, Jenna.
And I'm Laura.
I'm Krista.
And I'm Kayla.
Today, we are back for our final part of Christine Franke's case. Are you guys ready?
Yes. Can't wait to finish this one up. I've been waiting so long.
I know. We won't do that all the time, I promise.
I know I'm already going to be thinking about this one forever, but I'm ready to get to the end and figure out everything we know now.
Absolutely. If you haven't listened to parts 1, 2, and 3, go listen to those and then come back and join us for this final part. Should we dive right in?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's get going.
Okay. So when we talked last time, Benjamin Holmes was interviewing with detectives and he really did not give them any information. So at the end, he went back to his cell. A couple days following Benjamin's arrest, there was a press conference to announce that the case had been solved. Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer credited good police work for gathering the evidence that solved the case. From the beginning, with crime scene investigators collecting DNA evidence, to the people over the years that kept it safe, to the detectives never giving up and continuing to pursue all leads until a suspect was found. Detectives had collected almost 100 DNA samples and had interviewed hundreds of people. Thousands of hours of work had gone into working every lead and every piece of evidence. Christine's case was only the 15th in the country to be solved using forensic genealogy. Christine's mom, Tina, spoke to the media after the press conference. She said, quote, "I honestly thought that he was dead after 17 years and that we would never find out. This is such a blessing for our family," end quote. She expressed her gratitude for the investigators and their tenacity for sticking with the case over the years. She said, "This is a happy day for us. I never thought we would find him. Until recently, we didn't have a face. We didn't know anything. I mean, the person could live right around the corner from you and you don't know. So just having it settled in our minds and knowing that he's behind bars and can't hurt anybody. I would want that for anybody who's in a similar situation." Christine's family has a Facebook page called Christine Franke, #Justice for Chrissy. For the first few years on the page, they posted small updates and a reminder each year on Christine's birthday to go shoe shopping, which I love as a celebration in her honor. When Benjamin Holmes Jr. was arrested, his family was shocked. Some were outraged about being deceived for the reason police had requested DNA samples.
Understandably.
Mm-hmm.
Cynthia Young, who I mentioned earlier, told NBC News that she might not have submitted her DNA if she'd been told what it actually would be used for. She said, quote, "It bothered me because they came to my house and they lied," end quote.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's ethical.
Mm-mm.
No. Alvin Davis said that he would have given his DNA anyways, but he didn't like that they tricked him to get it. Benjamin's mom, Eleanor, was quoted as saying, "If I'd known my DNA was going to be used to investigate my child, I don't think I would have cooperated, just like my husband had declined to cooperate." John Hogan, whose DNA was the second highest match to Benjamin in GEDmatch, had put his DNA into the system because he was interested in learning about his heritage, his family, and his culture. He had wanted to look into his family's history of enslavement and his family's roots in the U.S. Hogan was interviewed after Benjamin was arrested and told Click Orlando, quote, "I've got like 650 fourth cousins and a bunch of second and third cousins. I have a huge, huge family. And when you told me that my DNA helped solve a 17-year-old cold case murder, I just couldn't believe it. The power of DNA, it's unbelievable." And as an aside, he had only learned about his DNA helping in the case when he was contacted by a News 6 reporter. So to continue with his statement, he said, quote, "When you told me that this suspect is basically a second cousin of mine, I could not believe it. I don't feel any guilt for unwittingly leading police to this relative of mine. I'm still glad my DNA is in GEDmatch, and if you break the law and commit a crime, and in this case, it's a murder, you have to stand trial for what you did and you have to go to jail. You have to pay the penalty," end quote. Hogan was asked if he knew Benjamin Holmes, and he said he had no recollection of meeting him. Christine's family felt bad that family members had been tricked into giving their DNA, but she said, quote, "I'm glad for the end result." Now, like I've said before, it wasn't illegal to do what police and detectives did, and there were very few rules surrounding this back in 2018. In November of 2019, the U.S. Department of Justice issued a policy on forensic genealogy, DNA analysis, and searching, which requires that in federal crimes, investigators must obtain informed consent from DNA relatives in order to obtain reference samples.
Yeah, I think that's a good rule there. Informed consent.
I think so too.
Yeah, because if they had known, some of them said they still would have given their DNA samples,
Mhm.
but then they wouldn't have felt tricked and lied to. They might have felt
They'd have more
okay.
trust in the process and the people
Yeah.
that are doing the work, right?
Absolutely. And then, even if it did come to someone, like the first guy, like the guy who they started with, he
Mhm.
said, if it leads to somebody, they committed that crime, they should serve for it. But at least the other family members wouldn't have felt so
Well, and especially his
betrayed.
mom.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Because
That's
they
so
knew.
terrible. Yeah.
They knew it was one of her kids.
Yeah. And they straight up lied. Like, oh, yeah, you're making it seem like she's helping solve a missing person from her family.
And
Like,
they absolutely should solve that now too,
yes.
right?
Yeah, for sure.
If they can.
Even with the informed consent, some people still might have cooperated to help out,
Mm-hmm.
but then they wouldn't feel so icky about it after.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, defense attorneys like Benjamin's try to use it. And if they're successful, that's not good either, because sometimes that might be the only evidence that you have
Yeah,
or what your case hinges on, right?
exactly.
I feel like, and yes, DNA is a huge part. And if your DNA is at the scene, and especially like in Christine Frankie's, the DNA that was there, but to say, oh, we found your DNA at the scene, it's like, okay, we had a party last week. There were 50 people here. I still think DNA is a very crucial and important part, but you need more.
I think you need to know without a doubt.
Yes.
It needs to be like, I know that's not always possible, but
Right.
for especially something like this, I want to know without a doubt that this is the person that did it. And if there's any doubt in my mind or in anyone's mind, then it shouldn't be going forward, in my opinion.
Well, that's all we have in this one.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
That's what I mean. Like in this case, it's pretty incriminating the kind of DNA. I'm saying like,
Right.
if
No,
you
I know what you
found
mean.
a fingerprint or you found, a cup or something like that. I don't
Yeah.
think that this could be viable moving forward. But I mean, this is a different circumstance.
Yeah, definitely.
So, like I said, this was used by Benjamin's defense lawyer in 2021 to try to get the DNA evidence in the case thrown out. In the motion they filed, it says, quote, "Through outright deception, they persuaded various relatives to provide samples of their DNA. They told them that the remains of a Black female victim were recently found in the woods and that they strongly suspected that she was related to them. By means of this malicious ruse, Detective Fields was able to overtake the various family members' resistance and reluctance to give their DNA. Without the DNA, the state could not have linked the DNA evidence found at the scene to Holmes. One of the individuals deceived by Detective Fields was Eleanor Holmes, the mother of Benjamin Holmes." End quote. Detective Fields had been deposed by the defense and had told them that they had used the story to obtain DNA from some of the family members. Fields told them also, quote, "In hindsight, it was a phenomenal family who I think absolutely would have given us the DNA." This motion from the defense was denied because it wasn't obtained illegally. Deceptively, yes. Illegally, no. On November 21st, 2018, Benjamin Holmes was charged with one count of second-degree murder with a firearm. A grand jury returned an indictment for a first-degree murder with a firearm, which is a capital offense. Holmes pleaded not guilty on December 5th, 2018. There was a hearing on February 20th, 2019 to determine if Holmes could be offered bail. The judge ordered the defendant to be held without bail and without bond. 2 years later, on February 8th, 2021, the defense filed the motion we talked about to dismiss the DNA evidence, which was denied. They also filed a motion to dismiss the case against their client entirely. They claimed the crime scene was staged to look like sexual assault. They included findings from the medical examiner stating that Christine had been moved after she was shot, which to them proved that the scene had been staged. They also pointed out that there was blood evidence, latent print evidence, and hair fiber evidence collected from the scene, and none of that was left there by Holmes. The motion also stated that apart from the semen, which, quote, allegedly came from him, there was no evidence of him being at Christine's apartment at all, including no evidence of a break-in. They were saying, without saying, they believed someone close to Christine committed the crime. They believed their defendant's DNA was planted at the scene. This motion, combined with the other motion to dismiss DNA evidence because of how it was obtained, was trying to show the only evidence was the DNA, and without that, they thought the prosecution had no case. This motion was also dismissed. Next up was the Daubert hearing, in which trials have to approve or challenge the qualifications of expert witnesses. This is used to determine whether an expert's scientific, technical, or specialized testimony is based on valid reasoning and methodology that can be applied to the facts of the case. Judges act as gatekeepers to decide if the expert's testimony is admissible under the Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 702. In these hearings, the opposing counsel may challenge the expert's qualifications, the relevance of their testimony, or the reliability of their methods. The judge decides whether the expert can testify. The defense wanted to bring in a crime scene staging expert to testify whether the crime scene in this case appeared staged. It is obvious that the defense had decided to try to place blame on Jen for this crime. In this case, it is desperate, but also we will find out together that many times it is the person closest to the victim, so that makes sense that this was the defense strategy that they tried to go with.
I think also she's had access to a 22, right?
25.
25, yeah.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's a little bit of a connection at least, and not just,
Right.
nothing to go on.
Right. And I mean, I don't think there was any other person that they could have tried.
To put it on.
Right, exactly. They wanted to make the case that she had a motive, being in a relationship with Christine and trying to say that she was jealous. They pointed to the phone calls from Jen to try to reach Christine as her establishing an alibi instead of being a worried and concerned girlfriend. There was no evidence of a break-in and really no proof that anything was stolen except her cash from the evening. The defense tried to talk about the different courses, conventions, and conferences the expert witness had attended. The defense pointed out that an expert can be an expert based on scientific knowledge, technical knowledge, or experience. The defense was hoping to lean on experience. This particular witness had started with the FBI in 1967 as a fingerprint examiner. She stayed in that role for 10 years. Her name was Janice Johnson. She then moved into latent print analysis. The judge ruled that there wasn't sufficient evidence that the expert for the defense was backed by science and ruled against the defense. No crime scene staging expert witness was allowed. Because the trial was hinging on the DNA evidence and the defense couldn't get it thrown out, they decided to try to cast doubt by bringing up the crime lab's contaminated samples that had included Christine's case. But because it didn't affect the sample they had from the crime scene, and it was so many years prior to getting the DNA comparison swab from Holmes, the judge ruled that they were not allowed to bring this up in trial. The judge also ruled that the defense was not able to talk about any illicit drug use from Jen, Clint, or Kelly. They wanted to cast doubt on what they remembered from the day it happened and to show that Christine maybe hung out with a rough crowd and it was possible someone else killed her. The judge also ruled the defense couldn't bring up Jen's arrest from the month before Christine was killed.
Why did they say? I mean, some of that seems like it might be relevant. I don't know.
I mean, the judge said that it wasn't related. He said that Jen's arrest had no connection to what happened to Christine, simply because it was a one-off. It
Yeah.
hadn't happened again. She didn't have any other history or anything since then, which I think also showed
Right.
that couldn't be part of it.
That makes sense.
Yeah. The drug use, I'm not entirely sure. And reading the case files, there were a couple of times where the defense attorney tried to get around it just a tiny bit and they shut it down really quick.
Hmm.
And they had certain times where they would interview Jen, Clint, and Kelly with the jury not in the room, and they would talk about it. So I guess the judges heard about it in all of the pretrial, you know, interviews and
okay.
everything. The judge knew all of that.
Okay.
Yeah. So by this point, the judge had not ruled in the defense's favor once, and it was going to be a tough trial. The DNA evidence was pretty damning. The prosecution offered Benjamin a plea deal before the trial started. If he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, he would get 35 years with possibility for parole after 25 years. Without taking the plea deal, Holmes was facing life in prison. He rejected the plea deal, so they went to trial. The trial started on January 30th, 2023.
Wow.
Yeah.
So 22 years?
Yes. Well, just barely
Okay.
21. Yeah. And a few months.
Just over 21. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Still.
But yes, now we're into 2023. And he was arrested in November of 2018. So it took a really long time. And I'm guessing COVID played a role
Yeah.
in the extensions and the length.
Was he in prison this whole time?
He was.
Oh, wow.
He wasn't able to post bond because they made it so that he couldn't.
Interesting.
They had the Honorable Petra Brownlee to proceed over the trial, and it took place in the Ninth Judicial Circuit. Assistant State Attorney Sean Wiggins was the lead prosecutor, and Jerry Gurley was the lead for the defense. Opening statements started with the prosecution laying out the basic timeline of what happened, talking about the DNA evidence that was found, and then they admitted there were still a lot of questions in this case. We don't know how the two came in contact or why Holmes did what he did, but we do know his DNA was left on her, and there was no question about the DNA evidence. The defense really only had that his DNA was planted at the scene. The defense said, quote, "The DNA evidence was planted by someone who knew the victim to deflect attention away from someone else," end quote. The defense...
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Did the defense ever bring up, and I don't know, maybe this is still a question, did the defense ever bring up if he was ever like a sperm donor, or like if he had ever participated in like medical research or like anything like that? Was that ever a question?
I did not find that. That was my question too. I never found that in reading or research, and I read the entire case file. So either he didn't or...
Okay. Or it was just never a
Mhm.
question.
I would like to know though.
Yeah, I feel like that would be one of my first questions.
That's what I thought too. That would be my first question. Like, did you ever, how would this have gotten out there if you're saying it wasn't you?
Yeah.
Like, if you're saying you weren't there and it was planted,
How?
is there a way that it could have been planted?
Well, right. And that seems like what would come to mind right away, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, oh, I actually did this back in 2000.
There's
so-
record of that.
Yeah,
Well, and if he hadn't, maybe they didn't want to bring that up.
yeah.
Right.
Right.
Be like, no, I never did. Okay, well, then it can't be planted, you know?
Because we also know that his DNA sample had only one genetic profile. So somebody couldn't have touched it
Right.
because their DNA would have been in
On
that
it.
sample too. It was only him and only Christine. And so,
Yeah.
it couldn't have...
But again, going back, there was no other DNA. There were 0 fingerprints, any of that. So it would make sense that, yeah, there's no other DNA in the sample.
Yeah, like, why would you be so careful
Yes.
and then not?
But what they're saying is like, it wasn't from him. It wasn't from him having sex, essentially, because then it would have had someone else's DNA on it. Like,
Yeah, that's
it had to be in a sterile, if you want to go down that path of it was planted.
yeah, that's what I'm meaning.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there wouldn't be any other DNA on that because they were being careful.
But if they're saying, say somebody else hypothetically wanted to pin this on him and maybe they had some kind of consensual relationship and then they used it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like it couldn't have been from
Yeah,
that.
no.
So that you can rule out. But like you said, from some kind of sperm bank donation or something.
Yeah, there's just a lot of things that like don't add up.
But
you know.
so like along those lines, the defense said, you know, what we were just talking about, there is zero other evidence connecting Holmes to the crime scene.
Mhm.
No fingerprints, no shoe prints, no skin cells, no witnesses. They maintained that someone as meticulous as this killer was to leave no other evidence wouldn't just leave their semen.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
that's what's been on my mind too.
Yeah.
Like,
It just
it
doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't make sense.
The defense also pointed out a lack of motive in this case. So the defense ended their opening statement by saying, quote, as Mr. Holmes sits here, the real killer is out there living his or her life and not being held accountable for committing this horrible, atrocious, heinous crime. There were many people called to testify in the case, including Jen, Kelly, and Clint, the original CSI investigators that had collected evidence, Dr. Anderson, the pathologist who had worked on the case, a forensic scientist, Laura Wentz, who was the FDLE DNA analyst, and the detectives who had worked the case all through the years. Detective Fields was the last witness the state called, and when the defense cross-examined him, they made a pretty big error. They asked if he had ever investigated whether the semen could have been planted. So he walked them through it. How would someone get that? Is there a black market where you can just buy it? He talked about the fact that the DNA was not contaminated at all. Therefore, it couldn't have come into contact with another human. It would have had to go directly into a sterile cup. It couldn't have been in a condom either because there are chemicals in there that would have been seen. He talked about how it landed a certain way and was consistent with what we know about ejaculate. There were no other options. There was no other way to get it to land exactly like that. He also pointed out that if someone was staging the scene and trying to make it look like a sexual crime, why would they have left it where they did? He said it doesn't make sense. Simply put, it defies all logic. This was when the state rested their case and the defense was not going to call any witnesses or provide any additional evidence, and they did not have Holmes testify.
Do you know why they didn't have him testify? And I know sometimes they don't just because they don't want to be on the stand, but I don't know. I'm wondering why.
I'm wondering that too, because everything that I've read, his interviews, everything, he denies knowing her, being there, having anything to do with it, ever owning a gun. I did not find any trace to him and a gun in any of the court files either.
Maybe they thought, some of his answers wouldn't be sufficient to prove him not guilty, either because it was so long ago or he just didn't have good answers. And so maybe that's why, like, if they're going to ask, where were you that night? And he's like, I don't remember. That's not going to look good to a jury, if
Right, exactly.
have good answers, that may be why.
Yeah, but
Especially
again, at
so
this
long
point,
ago.
it's been 21 years.
Yeah.
Right. It's been such a long time. That was interesting to read in the case files too. They're asking step by step, did you do this? They had Jen's mom also testify and they were asking her, did you go to Vero Beach and then come here? Just very specific questions. And they just had such a hard time remembering even the time frames from when they had given their first statements to when they were on trial, or not on trial, but in the trial. They had a hard time remembering what time things were. It's just such a long period of time.
It is.
It is a long time ago, especially for someone who, if he wasn't there, if he hadn't been thinking about that time in 21 years, I mean, how would you even remember?
Right.
And so maybe just because he wouldn't have good answers for them.
Yeah, which would make sense.
And maybe, he wouldn't come across as remorseful or sympathetic, things like that, that they didn't want the jury,
I can't remember if we already talked about this. Did he ever do, I know we've talked about how they're not admissible, but did he ever do a polygraph test?
I didn't find an example of one.
Okay.
I didn't see many polygraphs in this because they were getting the DNA samples.
Yeah, which I get, but
Mm-hmm.
it still seems like that might be something that's beneficial for at least detectives, even if it's not admissible.
Right. I agree. Like we said, this was when the state rested their case and the defense had already cross-examined all the witnesses that the state had brought in. The defense then moved for a judgment of acquittal, which the judge denied. Closing arguments from the prosecutor focused on the DNA. They didn't know all the whys of the case, but the DNA doesn't lie. He essentially walked them through what they had just heard from Detective Fields, that it's absurd to think the DNA was planted and the crime scene staged. In excruciating detail, he walked them through each step of that. Then he shared his theory on the case. His theory was Christine left work, drove home, and encountered Holmes while going into her apartment. He barged in before she could lock the door or even take her shoes off. The defense, in their closing arguments, stated that there was, and I quote, zero evidence linking my client to the murder, end quote. Not exactly zero evidence, but zero additional evidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Moving on, he said there is no connection established between Holmes and Christine, which he said proves that his client's semen was planted at the scene to place the guilt on him. It's unclear if they were trying to say the person who did this just didn't want to be found, or if he was maybe whoever did this trying to get Holmes specifically in trouble. But if it's the latter, the police weren't able to identify Holmes as the killer for 17 years, so that doesn't really make sense.
Did he have any other, not just with Christine, but did he have any other connection with anyone in her life? Were they able to find any connection?
No. And not to the car that they saw that night, right? Because that car that was circling City Walk parking lot at 3:47 and Christine left at 3:51.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I was thinking of is he did say he went to City Walk sometimes, right? He also said that he was selling weed at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe someone did have something against him and they're hanging out at the same place where she was. Maybe someone else knew her.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
I was also thinking if maybe she did try to buy it from him at that time and he saw how much money she had and just followed her home. Like, it's not like a solid connection, but I don't know. It's something.
I do feel like whoever was responsible probably was at City Walk that night. Christine already knew by her second shift that Jen wasn't coming home that night. She might have been talking about the dishwasher exploding and, that Jen had to stay to clean it up. Somebody could have overheard that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They could have overheard her saying she was working a double. They could have seen how busy it was, wanting to rob her. And maybe it really did go wrong,
Yeah.
They freaked out or something.
Well, I like what you were saying, Krista. Maybe he was there selling weed,
Mhm.
and if she pulled out cash to buy from him, they saw she had a huge wad of cash.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe someone else followed her home, not from the employee parking lot. If they were outside, that wouldn't have been seen on those security cameras.
Right. Because we don't know the timeline if she came
Right.
straight home or stopped somewhere.
She also had a food bag, didn't she?
Checkers.
That was already in the apartment.
Oh, it was. Okay.
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 Yeah, I don't think they would have been open at 4 a.m.
That's true.
Aren't some places open 24 hours?
That's true. That is true.
If it were like a McDonald's, I think.
Although every time I've been to Orlando, everything seems closed really early.
But that's a good theory, Krista.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree.
Because if she did stop to buy something, that's the only thing that they took.
Mm-hmm.
That seems plausible.
And they had all admitted to using weed back then.
Yeah. And if it's someone that you saw one time 21 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to remember.
I would hope you would remember if you killed somebody what they looked like. But,
Yeah, right.
I don't know.
Right. But as far as trying to find a connection between him and her, if he only met her once or twice 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Are you saying if he didn't do it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's what I'm
I
saying.
gotcha.
Oh, okay.
Hmm. the zero other evidence just gets me because he doesn't seem like he has got the criminal history
or a motive.
or a motive.
And again, if it's a
Robbery gone wrong, right?
then there wouldn't be motive for murder, like for personal reasons or anything like that. And, maybe someone who did see that she had a lot of cash that night. But it just, to me, it doesn't fully give me closure.
Well, and if you're
done,
if you're going to say the semen was planted there, then it's not a robbery and it's not
right.
just in the moment. That's something so much more.
Right. But then you only take the cash to make it look like it was a robbery gone wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yes, there was cash missing from the scene. They did take something.
Right.
I almost feel like it's two different people.
Mm.
Like Holmes later, someone else actually killed her. I don't know. I can't connect in my mind how someone would be so careful, leave zero other evidence, and then leave that behind. It feels like two people to me, but I don't know.
I mean, if he was there with someone else, I don't know how you would come onto that scene unknowingly. But if he had gone there with someone else, why didn't he give that person up?
Well, again, going back to what we talked about in the first episode, if she got home at 4 a.m., you have 11 hours between when she got home and Kelly found her. So how many other people were coming and going from that apartment complex in those 11 hours?
While her door is cracked open as well.
Yes, while her door is open.
Well, and it seems like her door had to be by the stairs, right? So people, you would think, but it was a Sunday morning, so people most likely aren't going to work.
And they could have thought, her door was just cracked open, like if it's a neighbor or something.
Right, yeah.
Because she went to get something. But if you want to say that person was coming to search for easy to enter or something to rob and her door's open and they see that mess, it doesn't make sense that you would leave your DNA there.
But also, it was during the day. So people usually aren't out looking to break into someone's apartment at 8 a.m.,
Mm-hmm. Right. I don't know.
There's a lot of questions, I guess, still open for all of us.
I still have a lot of questions.
I do too. And when I first started researching this, I picked this case because I wanted to demonstrate that cases can be solved after a significant amount of time due to the increase in technology and the way that DNA has changed how crimes are solved. This season of justice, they're coming for you. If you did something, they're coming for you. And by the time I got done with this one, I have more questions. And this one was supposed to be the one that,
This one was supposed to give me closure. Jenna.
I know.
We talked about this.
I know.
You got false closure, Kayla.
Yeah. And
A false sense of hope.
this case is on appeal, but there's been no movement for at least 6 months. And the last update from 6 months ago was just saying that they had missed a deadline for filing paperwork. And nothing has really moved since he was sentenced and they filed their first appeal. So we'll definitely keep watching it, but I would love more information. So the defense also asked in their closing arguments, if the motive was sexual assault, why did he shoot her first? And if the motive was robbery, why didn't he take her checkbook and her credit cards? And if he came to rob her, why would he take the time to leave behind his DNA? He finished up by saying the state had not proven their burden. The prosecution was able to give a rebuttal to the defense's closing arguments. He again pointed out that the DNA does exist, and there's only one logical way that it got there. He ended with reminding the jury that Christine came face to face with Benjamin Holmes and lost her life. And for 18 years, he was out walking and living his life free. On February 7th, 2023, the jury started deliberations at 4:36 p.m. and reached a verdict just shy of 3 hours later. It read, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder as charged in the indictment. So say we all. The defense immediately moved to throw out the verdict and requested a new trial. On March 23rd, they had the sentencing hearing, and the motion for the new trial had been denied. There were victim impact statements delivered by Christine's family. Christine's sister said that the family seeks to find joy in Christine's memory. They expressed how hard it had been learning what had happened and picking up the pieces. The defendant was also permitted to give a statement. He continued his denial of having anything to do with Christine's murder. He said he had a phobia of blood, and seeing those pictures for the first time in 2018, he almost threw up. He said he told the detectives over and over that he didn't do it. He didn't know Christine. He said he had been in jail for 4 years and 4 months for a crime someone else committed. He said that in 2001, he was ordained to be a deacon at a missionary Baptist church in Taft. He took the role seriously because his father was a pastor. He said he had a good employment history since he was 16. He wouldn't steal from anyone, and he had a good work ethic. He said he was embarrassed to be in this situation in front of his family. He didn't know how his semen ended up there. He ended with, quote, "I'm sorry, it's really hard. It truly is. But I am not the man or the person who murdered Christine Franke. I'm not. Unfortunately, I'm the man who's been found guilty for it. And it hurts. It does hurt," end quote. The judge then sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He received credit for time served, but with the life sentence, it didn't really matter. After the trial was over, Detective Fields testified in a deposition on his personal theory on the case. He prefaced it by saying his theory was totally speculative, but he thinks Holmes encountered Christine at Cigars that night she was murdered, and maybe even had met her there before. Christine was very friendly and may have mentioned in chatting with Holmes or other patrons, and he overheard her that her roommate was out of town. She may have mentioned she worked a double shift, maybe even saying that it was a long day, but the tip money was worth it. Fields continued by saying he thinks the attack started as just a robbery that went south quickly. Maybe the shooting happened in a struggle or a panic. So like I said, currently the case shows on appeal, and the last update was June 2024. As far as I know, the case is just sitting in the same place. I will keep checking for updates and let you guys know. Just as an aside, Kelly and Clint did get married, and they had a son. He's 19 or 20 now. That's the case of Christine Franke. What do you guys think?
What happened to Jen?
Jen was still working with her furniture store in Vero Beach. I didn't see if she was married or not.
Okay.
So she moved back out there after everything?
Yeah.
Do you know? Okay.
Yep, she did. So if you want to read more about this case, check out crimeclueless.com for all the sources we used. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Crime Clueless. Any other thoughts, guys?
I don't know. I feel like it just, I mean, like I've already said multiple times, I don't feel like everything adds up.
I agree.
I would like to know so much more from Benjamin Holmes, because some of these things they might have looked into that we talked about and it didn't happen. You know, they might have looked into if he donated sperm, because really that's the only way it could have been planted there.
Yeah.
And if he didn't, they're not going to bring that up
Right.
for the prosecution, right?
Yeah, because they don't want, if it didn't happen, they don't want to put that out there.
Right.
Like, oh, there is no other way.
Right. Because really you could be left sitting like we are with the same questions.
Yeah.
Maybe they hoped the jury had those.
Yeah.
I'm surprised the jury found their verdict so quickly.
I know, me too. It was only a couple of hours.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, if like the only evidence they have to go on is DNA, and that's what they're ruling it as.
Right.
Well, and what Detective Fields said, that made it pretty conclusive that it come from him. So
Yeah, he had to at least been there.
Yeah, the statements that he said,
right.
I mean, it makes it hard to say it was planted if that evidence shows that that's the only way it got there.
Right. So I don't know.
I don't know either.
I need to do more research, see if I can find any of these answers, because I have not been able to so far, which might mean they don't exist. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well,
It's a very interesting case, Jenna. Thank
It
you
was.
for bringing that to us. And I'm glad that we
Yeah.
finally got a conclusion here, even if it's not the satisfying one we wanted.
I have a couple more cold cases coming up for you that have been solved recently.
Conclusively? Or this
Jenna, are you
fake
going to do this
closure?
to me again?
How
Maybe.
not next time.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for listening. Remember, refuse to be careless, clueless, or caught off guard.
Not today, murderers.
Bye.
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 Bye.